They found children's shoes under this mansion, dozens of pairs, from different centuries, along with bones. But here's the thing that made the excavation team quit. The shoes were arranged in rows, like they were waiting in line. Stay with me, because this story gets so much darker. Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild built Waddesdon Manor in 1874, but the locals in Buckinghamshire never wanted it there. Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild built Waddesdon Manor in 1874, but the locals in Buckinghamshire never wanted it there. The construction took 6 years. During that time, 17 workers died. Official records say it was accidents falls from scaffolding, now crushed by stones. One man buried alive when a foundation wall collapsed, but the villagers whispered about something else. They said the hill itself was angry, for the manor, that hilltop had been empty for centuries. There were stories about why. The hill had a name once, though it's been forgotten now. The oldest residents called it Watcher's Peak, though no one could say who or what was doing the watching. Shepherds avoided it. Farmers wouldn't graze livestock there, even during drought when grass was scarce everywhere else. Children were forbidden from playing on its slopes. When pressed for reasons, the villagers would only say that nothing good grew on that hill, and nothing good ever would. In 1641, during the English Civil War, a field hospital was set up on that hill. A physician named Dr. Thomas Wickham chose the location specifically high ground. Good air, away from the pestilence of the camps below. Wounded soldiers were brought there to recover, but none ever left. For 3 weeks, supply wagons delivered food and medicine. The drivers reported that the tents were always quiet, too quiet. No moaning, no crying out in pain, just silence. When parliamentary forces finally investigated, they found the medical tent abandoned. Inside were 23 beds, each occupied by a skeleton still wrapped in bandages. The bodies showed no signs of violence or disease, no indication of poison or plague. They had simply stopped living. Dr. Wickham was never found, though his journal remained open on a wooden crate he'd used as a desk. The final entry, dated 3 weeks after he'd arrived, contained only one line written in increasingly erratic handwriting. They breathe in the day and die in the night, and I cannot stop listening to what the ground tells me. The ground was consecrated afterward, blessed by 3 different clergymen. A stone marker was placed at the summit with a warning carved in Latin. Let no foundation be laid here. Beneath it, in smaller letters that weather had nearly eroded, what sleeps below must not be disturbed. For 200 years, the hill remained empty. Ferdinand either never knew about the marker or he didn't care. He wanted a château that could be seen for miles, a statement of wealth and power visible from every approach. The hill was perfect. Duh. His workers found the warning stone while clearing the land. The foreman, a man named William Garrett, wanted to stop construction immediately. He'd grown up in the village. He knew the stories. Ferdinand had him fired on the spot and ordered the stone destroyed, broken into pieces, and scattered. 3 days later, William Garrett's body was found at the base of the hill. His neck was broken, his face twisted in an expression of absolute terror. But here was the detail that haunted everyone who saw him. His footprints in the mud showed he'd walked down the hill backward, step by careful step, as if he'd been staring at something following him from above, as if he hadn't dared turn his back on it. The tracks were measured. He'd walked backward for nearly half a mile before he either fell or was pushed. After Garrett's death, workers began quitting. Ferdinand raised their wages. More workers quit. He raised them again. High enough that men came from London, men who didn't know the stories. But even they felt it, that sensation of being observed from just beyond sight. The weight of attention from something that didn't blink. The manor rose anyway, stone by stone, a French Renaissance château impossibly perched on English soil. It was magnificent, with its towers and turrets, its limestone facade glowing golden in sunlight. It was also wrong. Something about its proportions seemed subtly off, as if the building itself was leaning slightly, listening slightly, waiting slightly. Visitors reported feeling watched from the moment they approached, long before they reached the doors. Servants refused to work in certain wings after dark, particularly the east wing, where the air felt thicker somehow, harder to breathe. And Ferdinand himself began keeping strange hours. Often found wandering the halls at 3 a.m, holding conversations with people who weren't there. When his butler finally worked up the courage to ask who he'd been talking to, Ferdinand looked at him with eyes that seemed decades older than they'd been just months before. "The previous residents," he said. "They want to show me something. They keep trying to take me below." He never explained what he meant by below, but the servants noticed that he stopped going down to the wine cellars entirely. The construction took 6 years. During that time, 17 workers died. The official records say it was accidents, falls from scaffolding, crushed by stones. One man buried alive when a foundation wall collapsed. But the villagers whispered about something else. They said the hill itself was angry, for the manor, that hilltop, had been empty for centuries. There were stories about why. The hill had a name once, though it's been forgotten now. The oldest residents called it Watcher's Peak, though no one could say who or what was doing the watching. Shepherds avoided it. Farmers wouldn't graze livestock there, even during drought when grass was scarce everywhere else. Children were forbidden from playing on its slopes. When pressed for reasons, the villagers would only say that nothing good grew on that hill, and nothing good ever would. In 1641, during the English Civil War, a field hospital was set up on that hill. A physician named Dr. Thomas Wickham chose the location specifically: high ground, good air, away from the pestilence of the camps below. Wounded soldiers were brought there to recover, but none ever left. For 3 weeks, supply wagons delivered food and medicine. The drivers reported that the tents were always quiet. It's quiet. No moaning, no crying out in pain, just silence. When parliamentary forces finally investigated, they found the medical tent abandoned. Inside were 23 beds, each occupied by a skeleton still wrapped in bandages. The bodies showed no signs of violence or disease, no indication of poison or plague. They had simply stopped living. Dr. Wickham was never found, though his journal remained open on a wooden crate he'd used as a desk. The final entry, dated 3 weeks after he'd arrived, contained only one line written in increasingly erratic handwriting. "They breathe in the day and die in the night, and I cannot stop listening to what the ground tells me." The ground was consecrated afterward, blessed by 3 different clergymen. A stone marker was placed at the summit with a warning carved in Latin: "Let no foundation be laid here." Beneath it, in smaller letters that weather had nearly eroded, "What sleeps below must not be disturbed." For 200 years, the hill remained empty. Ferdinand either never knew about the marker, or he didn't care. He wanted a château that could be seen for miles, a statement of wealth and power visible from every approach. The hill was perfect. His workers found the warning stone while clearing the land. The foreman, a man named William Garrett, wanted to stop construction immediately. He'd grown up in the village. He knew the stories. Ferdinand had him fired on the spot and ordered the stone destroyed, broken into pieces and scattered. 3 days later, William Garrett's body was found at the base of the hill. His neck was broken, his face twisted in an expression of absolute terror. But here was the detail that haunted everyone who saw him. His footprints in the mud showed he'd walked down the hill backward, step by careful step, as if he'd been staring at something following him from above, as if he hadn't dared turn his back on it. The tracks were measured. He'd walked backward for nearly half a mile before he either fell or was pushed. After Garrett's death, workers began quitting. Ferdinand raised their wages. More workers quit. He raised them again, high enough that men came from London, men who didn't know the stories. But even they felt it, that sensation of being observed from just beyond sight. The weight of attention from something that didn't blink. The manor rose anyway, stone by stone, a French Renaissance château impossibly perched on English soil. It was magnificent, with its towers and turrets. Its limestone facade, glowing golden in sunlight, was also wrong. Something about its proportions seemed subtly off, as if the building itself was leaning slightly, listening slightly, waiting slightly. Visitors reported feeling watched from the moment they approached, long before they reached the doors. Servants refused to work in certain wings after dark, particularly the east wing, where the air felt thicker somehow, harder to breathe. And Ferdinand himself began keeping strange hours. He was often found wandering the halls at 3 in the morning, holding conversations with people who weren't there. When his butler finally worked up the courage to ask who he'd been talking to, Ferdinand looked at him with eyes that seemed decades older than they'd been just months before. "The previous residents," he said. "They want to show me something." They keep trying to take me below." He never explained what he meant by below, but the servants noticed that he stopped going down to the wine cellars entirely. Ferdinand filled his mansion with treasures. He had paintings by Gainsborough and Reynolds, Sevres porcelain, Beauvais tapestries, furniture that had belonged to French kings. But his true obsession was his portrait collection, specifically portraits of children. He acquired hundreds of them over the years. Most were 18th century oil paintings of aristocratic children, their faces pale and solemn, dressed in silks and velvets. He hung them throughout the manor, particularly along the long gallery, a corridor that stretched nearly 200 feet. Servants swore they could hear children whispering in that gallery at night, soft voices speaking in languages that hadn't been used in centuries. The sound stopped the moment anyone entered, leaving only a ringing silence that felt somehow worse than the whispers. One painting disturbed everyone who saw it. It showed a girl of about 8, dressed in white, holding a small bird. The bird was dead in her hands, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle, but the girl was smiling, not a child's innocent smile, something older, knowing, patient. The painting had no signature, no date, no record of its origin. Ferdinand claimed he'd found it at an estate sale in France, but when pressed for details, he could never remember which estate, which year, or even which region. It was as if the memory simply wouldn't stay in his mind. The painting's frame was unusual black wood. It was carved with symbols that didn't match any artistic tradition his art historians could identify. One of them, a scholar from Oxford, spent 3 hours examining the frame before refusing to return to Waddesdon. He would only say that the symbols were old, older than they should be, and that some of them resembled marks found in English folk magic, the kind used for binding. The housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, kept detailed journals during her employment from 1889 to 1898. She was a practical woman, skeptical by nature, but her entries grew increasingly disturbed. In one she wrote, "The painting of the girl with the bird has been moved again. This is the 4th time this month. No. Servant will admit to touching it, and Lord Ferdinand grows angry when questioned. He says she likes to wander." When I asked what he meant, he simply stared at the painting and said, "She goes to visit the others at night. I can hear her footsteps in the gallery, small and light, like a child dancing." Mrs. Pritchard began marking the painting's position with small pencil marks on the wall. It's invisible unless you knew to look for them. The painting moved 17 times in 2 months, sometimes just a few feet, sometimes 2 entirely different rooms. Once, she found it in the nursery wing, facing a wall covered with water stains that, if you looked at them in a certain light, almost resembled the silhouettes of small figures. In another entry dated December 1892, Mrs. Pritchard wrote about a visit from Ferdinand's nephew. Little Lord Ferdinand came to visit for Christmas. He is 6 years old, a sweet child with bright eyes. He refused to sleep in the blue room after the first night. He said a girl in a white dress stood at the foot of his bed and asked him to come play in the garden. When I asked what game, he went very quiet, then whispered, "The game where we stop breathing." She said it doesn't hurt after the first minute. She said all her friends are playing and they're waiting for more children. We moved him to a different room immediately, as far from the long gallery as possible, but distance didn't seem to matter. The boy woke screaming every night of his visit. On the final night, his mother found him standing at his bedroom window, his hand pressed against the glass. When she turned him around, his palm was filthy with dirt, as if he'd been digging, but the window had never been opened. The earth was on the inside of the glass. Ferdinand's obsession grew worse as the years passed. He commissioned more portraits, though the artists he hired found the work unsettling. He would stand over them while they painted, insisting they capture something specific in the children's eyes. "Look," he'd say, "the one that knows something we don't. The one that's seen what waits." One artist, a woman named Catherine Moore, left a letter with her solicitor to be opened upon her death. She died in 1894, just 3 months after completing a commission for Ferdinand. The letter read, "I painted 12 children for the Baron. I used living models, healthy children from good families. Within a year of completing their portraits, 7 of those children died. Different causes: scarlet fever, drowning, a fall from a window. But I dream of them now. They stand together in a long room, and they're waiting. They're all waiting. And behind them, barely visible in the shadows, are so many others." The Baron knows what he's doing. He's collecting them. God forgive me, I helped him. By 1898, Ferdinand had amassed 347 portraits of children. He knew each one by heart, their names, their ages, the families they'd come from. He talked about them as if they were alive, as if they visited him. Perhaps in some terrible way they did. Baron Ferdinand died in 1898. He left the manor to his sister's son, James de Rothschild. James didn't want it. He'd visited as a child and remembered the uncomfortable silence that filled certain rooms. The way doors would be open when you were certain you'd closed them, the portraits that seemed to follow you with their eyes. He remembered his Uncle Ferdinand sitting alone in the long gallery at twilight, speaking softly to the walls, as if having an intimate conversation. Most of all, he remembered the dreams, terrible dreams of being underground, of small spaces, of dozens of children's voices calling his name from somewhere beneath the floors. But family duty demanded he accept. The Rothschilds' legacy was one of preserving beauty and history. Waddesdon was both. So James moved in with his new wife, Dorothy, in the spring of 1899. He told himself the unease he felt was simply grief and memory. Old houses always felt strange at first. James made changes immediately. He hired new staff, updated the gas lighting, brought in fresh flowers for every room. And he had the portrait of the girl with the bird removed from the house and burned. He stood in the garden and watched it himself, watched the flames consume the canvas and the twisted frame with its strange symbols. The smoke rose black and thick. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he heard a child's laughter carried on the wind. 3 days later, the portrait was back in its place on the long gallery wall. The frame cool to the touch, the canvas showing no signs of fire damage. The girl smiled her knowing smile, the dead bird twisted in her pale hands. James tried again. This time, he had it taken 20 miles away and burned in a blacksmith's forge, until nothing remained but ash, which he scattered in running water. The painting returned within 2 days. On the third attempt, he buried the canvas in a lead box, 6 feet underground on the far edge of the property. It was back by morning, hanging exactly where it had always hung, without a trace of dirt. After the 4th attempt, James left it alone. His hands shook when he looked at it now. In the margin of his personal diary, he wrote, "It wants to be here. She wants to be here. Fighting only makes it angry, and I fear what angry might mean." His wife, Dorothy, was a practical woman who didn't believe in superstition. She'd been raised in an era of science and reason, and she met the world with clear eyes and a sharp mind. That changed after 6 months at Waddesdon. She began insisting that household staff always work in pairs, never alone. That doors be left open rather than closed. That lamps be kept burning all night in the long gallery. Even though the oil was expensive and the light disturbed the painting's preservation, when James asked why, she showed him something she'd been documenting in her diarrhea project she'd kept secret, not wanting to sound foolish. She'd been taking photographs of the manor's rooms for an inventory project. Using the new Kodak camera James had given her, photography was her hobby, her one creative outlet. She was methodical about it, photographing each room from the same angle, at the same time of day, ensuring consistency. In 17 different photographs, taken on different days in different rooms, there was a figure in the background. Always the same figure, young girl in a white dress, slightly blurred, as if she'd been moving. Dorothy had been completely alone in each room when she took these pictures. She'd checked. She'd locked the doors. The most disturbing photo showed the long gallery. Dorothy had taken it at noon, when sunlight streamed through the tall windows. In the far end of the corridor, barely visible in the shadows that shouldn't have existed in such bright light, was the girl. But there were other shapes too, smaller and less distinct. Dozens of them, clustered along the walls beneath the portraits. They could have been shadows. It could have been tricks of light and development chemistry. But Dorothy had studied each shape with a magnifying glass. They had faces, small, pale faces, all turned toward the camera, all turned toward her. She showed James another photograph, this one taken in the library. On the ladder used for reaching high shelves, there was a small handprint in the dust. Dorothy's notes indicated she'd cleaned that ladder herself the morning before the photograph. The handprint was the size a 6-year-old child might make. But there were no children in the house. Dorothy left Waddesdon permanently in 1903. The staff found her note on the breakfast table, her wedding ring beside it. She'd taken only a single bag. James found her 3 days later at her sister's home in London. She refused to discuss what had happened, refused to return, even to collect her belongings. Her sister mentioned in a letter to her own husband that Dorothy had arrived in the middle of the night, pale and shaking, her hair streaked with something that looked like dirt. Years later, on her deathbed, Dorothy finally told her sister what had driven her away. She'd woken one night to find her bedroom filled with children standing silently around her bed waiting. Dozens of them, their faces pale in the moonlight, clothes from different eras, Georgian silks, Victorian cotton, medieval wool. When she screamed, they didn't vanish like dreams should. They simply turned all at once with terrible synchronization and walked through the walls. But before they left, the girl in the white dress, the one from the portrait, the one from Dorothy's photographs, had leaned close to her ear and whispered, "He promised us more. The first one who built here, he promised us more children to play with. Are you going to give us children, Mrs. Dorothy?" Dorothy never had children. She never returned to Waddesdon, and she never, until that final confession, spoke her husband's name again. When World War II came, Waddesdon was used to house evacuated children from London. It seemed like a perfect solution, a grand, safe mansion far from the Blitz, with dozens of rooms and expansive grounds where children could run and play in safety. The children arrived in September 1939, just days after war was declared. 43 of them, aged 6 to 14. Clutching small suitcases and gas masks, their identification tags pinned to their coats. They came from the East End, from families who lived in the shadow of the docks, the first targets. Everyone knew when the bombs began to fall. Their parents kissed them goodbye at the train station, promising it would only be for a little while, promising they'd be safe in the countryside. By November, only 31 remained. 12 had been quietly sent home at their parents' desperate insistence, despite the danger of the bombing raids. The parents who came to collect their children wouldn't explain their reasons to the billeting officer. They simply arrived, sometimes in the middle of the night, and took their children away. One mother, a Mrs. Patricia Thornton, said only, "My daughter hasn't spoken a word in 3 weeks. She just stares at the walls and digs at the floorboards with her fingernails. I'd rather risk the bombs." The teacher, supervising them, Miss Sarah Bellingham, wrote regular reports to the Education Board. Her early reports were cheerful, full of details about lessons in the library and nature walks through the gardens. The children were adapting well, she wrote. They were eating properly and sleeping soundly. By October, her tone had changed dramatically. The children have become strange in their play, she wrote on October 12th. They gather in the long gallery and stand motionless for hours, facing the portraits. When I ask what game they're playing, they say, "The waiting game." They say the children in the paintings taught them. The game has only one rule: stand perfectly still and hold your breath as long as you can. The child who can hold their breath the longest wins. I've forbidden them from that corridor, but I hear them there at night. And in the morning, I find small footprints in the dust, far more footprints than 31 children could make. A week later, a report grew more frantic. Young Timothy Roscoe, age 9, was found standing in the garden at dawn, his feet bare and muddy despite the frost. His nightclothes were soaked with dew. When asked what he was doing, he said, "Digging." But he had no tools, and his hands were bleeding, his fingernails torn and packed with earth. When I examined the spot where he'd been standing, I found disturbed earth, a hole nearly 2 feet deep. Something had been digging from below. The sides of the hole were scratched with marks that couldn't have been made by Timothy's small hands. The scratches came from underneath, clawing upward. Miss Bellingham reported other incidents. Children sleepwalking in groups, found standing in circles in various rooms, holding hands. A girl named Emma Price who began speaking in French, though she'd never learned the language, speaking in an archaic dialect that the local vicar identified as 17th century. 2 boys discovered in the wine cellar, though the door had been locked, pressing their ears against the stone walls and giggling at something they claimed to hear moving behind the bricks. The incident that ended the evacuation happened on December 3, 1943. Children went missing during the night, 2 girls and a boy, ages 7, 8, and 9. Margaret Wells, Susan Harper, and David Pritchard. A search began at dawn when their beds were found empty. The staff searched every room, every closet, every corner of the vast estate. It took 4 hours to find them. They were in the manor's wine cellars, in a section that had been locked and wasn't included in the children's permitted areas. The door's lock had been broken from the inside, the metal twisted as if by tremendous force, though the door itself showed no damage. The 3 children were standing in a circle around a brick wall, their backs to the searchers. They were singing a song in a language no one recognized, a melody that made Miss Bellingham's teeth ache. The brick wall they faced had been partially dismantled. Bricks lay scattered across the floor, removed with methodical precision. Behind them was a small space, a chamber barely large enough for a child, a deliberately constructed hiding place, or perhaps a tomb. Inside was a skeleton, small and delicate, the bones arranged in a sitting position. It was dressed in rotting fabric that might once have been white. In the skeleton's hands, positioned with obvious care, was a dead bird, perfectly preserved despite what must have been centuries. Its neck was still twisted at that unnatural angle. Around the small skull was a circlet of braided hair, dark and lustrous, as if it had been placed there yesterday. The 3 children didn't respond when their names were called. They simply stood there, swaying slightly, continuing their song. When Miss Bellingham finally touched young David's shoulder, all 3 children collapsed as if strings had been cut. They woke hours later with no memory of the night. But all 3 had developed a peculiar habit: they would stop breathing for long periods, timing themselves, competing to see who could last the longest. The children were removed from Waddesdon that day. All of them, despite the protests of the billeting authorities who needed places for evacuees. Parents arrived in trucks and cars, ignoring petrol rationing, ignoring official orders. Miss Bellingham's final report to the Education Board contained only 1 line, written in handwriting that shook so badly it was almost illegible. "This house feeds on innocence. Keep it empty. Lock the doors. For God's sake, never let children inside again." The skeleton was reburied in the local churchyard, but the vicar insisted on 3 separate services of exorcism. First, the bird was burned. The chamber in the cellar was filled with concrete and sealed behind a new brick wall. But the portrait of the girl with the dead bird remained hanging in the long gallery, smiling her patient smile, waiting for the house to fill with children once more. In 1957, James de Rothschild died at the age of 69. His will was detailed and precise, leaving Waddesdon Manor to the National Trust with extensive provisions for its maintenance and preservation. But there was one condition that puzzled the executors. His private study was never to be opened. The room was to be sealed, its door locked, and the key destroyed. No explanation was given. No exceptions were to be made. The trust honored his wishes without question. The door was locked, then sealed with wooden boards nailed across its frame. Staff were instructed to avoid that corridor entirely. When tours routes were planned for the public opening of Waddesdon, that wing was excluded. For 40 years, the room sat undisturbed, a mystery at the heart of the manor. In 1997, during extensive renovation work to address structural concerns, a structural engineer named Michael Davies insisted the room had to be inspected for safety reasons. Water damage had been detected in the walls of the surrounding corridor. Now, there was concern about rot spreading through the manor's framework. The trust board debated for 3 months before reluctantly agreeing. They would open the room, conduct the inspection, and seal it again immediately. They drilled out the lock on a gray morning in November. Michael was accompanied by 2 trust officials and a photographer to document the room's condition. The door resisted at first. The wood warped after decades of disuse. When it finally opened, the air that rushed out was cold and stale, carrying a smell like old paper and something else, something sweet and rotten underneath, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Inside, they found James's study exactly as he'd left it. His desk sat in the center, covered with a fine layer of dust. A chair was positioned before it, and on the desk lay a fountain pen, its ink long dried. But what struck them immediately, what made the photographer lower his camera with trembling hands, were the walls. Every surface was covered entirely with children's drawings, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, tacked up edge to edge, overlapping in places, covering every inch of wall space from floor to ceiling. They were crude sketches done in pencil and charcoal stick figures, roughhouses, simple faces with circular eyes, the kind of drawings young children make, but certain images repeated with obsessive frequency. A girl in a dress holding something small, a hilltop with a building perched on top, groups of small figures lying down in neat rows, children standing in a long corridor facing what appeared to be portraits, and one image that appeared at least 30 times, drawn in different hands, in different styles, but always showing the same thing: a skeleton tucked into a tiny space behind a wall, holding what looked like a bird. The drawings were dated. Michael noticed this as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the boarded windows. The earliest was from 1905, just 2 years after Dorothy had fled. The dates continued in irregular intervals: 1907, 1911, 1918, 1923, spanning decades. The latest was dated December 15th, 1957, the day before James died. At the bottom of that last drawing, in an elderly man's shaking handwriting that bore little resemblance to James's earlier elegant script, were words that made Michael's blood run cold. "She showed me what happens to the children who don't leave. She showed me where they go when the house takes them. Now she says I'm too old to play, but not too old to understand, not too old to see. They're still here. All of them. Oh. In the walls, under the floors, in the spaces between spaces. I'm so sorry I didn't tear it down when Dorothy begged me to. I'm so sorry I didn't burn it to the ground. It's too late now. It won't let me. I tried last week, gathered all the kerosene I could find, but my hands wouldn't strike the match. Something held them. Something whispered that the house has work left to do. God forgive me." Beneath this, in child's handwriting that seemed to have been added later, though how much later was impossible to say, were the words, "Thank you for the pictures, Mr. James. We like drawing. Will you play with us now?" Michael stepped closer to the desk, his boots echoing in the silent room. In the center, beneath a glass paperweight, was a photograph. It showed the long gallery, and in it stood dozens of children. But this wasn't a photograph from the war evacuation or any official record. The children in this image wore clothes from different eras, some in 18th century dress, others in Victorian garb, a few in the simple smocks of medieval peasants. They stood in groups, in pairs, alone, filling the gallery from end to end. And every single child was staring directly at the camera with expressions of terrible patience. In the foreground, clearest of all, was a girl in a white dress, holding a small bird with a twisted neck. The photographer who'd been documenting the inspection refused to take any pictures in the study. He left the room and quit his position with the trust that afternoon. Michael Davies completed his structural assessment. The walls were sound. No rot, no water damage. Despite what the surveys had indicated, and submitted his report, but he included a personal note that he asked to be sealed in the Trust's archives. Whatever James de Rothschild saw in that room drove him to cover the walls with drawings that spanned 50 years. Either he drew them all himself, slowly going mad over decades, or something else drew them. I don't know which possibility terrifies me more. When we first opened the door, before we turned on our torches, I heard something. Not quite breathing, more like dozens of people trying very hard not to breathe, like children playing a game. I could feel them in there watching us, waiting to see if we'd stay and play. The room was sealed again within 3 days, the door locked and boarded more securely than before. The Trust added a new clause to its documentation. The study was never to be opened again, under any circumstances. But sometimes, late at night, security guards report hearing sounds from behind that sealed door. Not voices exactly, more like pencils scratching on paper, drawing and drawing and drawing, adding more pictures to walls that are already full, creating new invitations that will never be sent. Today, Waddesdon Manor is a popular tourist attraction. Over 400,000 people visit each year, drawn by its stunning architecture, world-class art collection, and immaculate gardens. The National Trust has done everything right, restored the painted ceilings, preserved the gilded furniture, cataloged every piece of Sèvres porcelain. They run children's events and educational programs. School groups visit regularly. Wedding receptions are held in the garden pavilion. From the outside, it looks like the perfect historic estate. But the staff turnover is extraordinary. Security guards rarely last more than 6 months. Tour guides often request transfers to other National Trust properties after just a season or two. When exit interviews are conducted, responses are always vague. Personal reasons, family obligations, career opportunities elsewhere. No one wants to admit the real reason. No one wants to sound insane. And there are rules, unofficial, but strictly observed by those who work there long enough to learn them. These rules are never written down, never mentioned in staff training. But they're passed along in whispers during tea breaks, shared between colleagues during closing duties. Never be alone in the long gallery after the sun sets. If you must walk through it after dark, do it quickly, and don't look at the portraits. Don't look at them directly, and for God's sake, don't count them. Never count the portraits of children, the number changes. One security guard made the mistake of counting them during his rounds. He got to 347, then started again from the beginning to be certain. The second count came to 351. The third count was 355. He quit before dawn and never came back. Never opened the door to the sealed study, even though restoration committees have discussed reopening it to the public multiple times. They tried once, in 2003, after a generous donor offered funding for a complete restoration of that wing. The door was unsealed on a Monday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, it was sealed again, and the restoration project was quietly canceled. The 3 workers who'd entered the room to assess it all requested immediate medical leave. One of them still sends the trust an annual letter, always the same message. Burn it. Burn the whole room. Burn the drawings before they finish. Never work alone in the cellar storage areas. Always go in pairs. Always keep the lights on, even during the day. The wine cellar, especially the section where the hidden chamber was found in 1940, should be accessed only when absolutely necessary. Several staff members have reported the smell of freshly disturbed earth down there, despite the concrete floor that was poured decades ago. Others have heard scratching sounds coming from behind the sealed wall, rhythmic and persistent, like small fingers trying to dig through. In 2015, a wedding was held at Waddesdon on a beautiful June afternoon. The ceremony took place in the gardens, the reception in the grand hall. Everything was perfect till the bride's 8-year-old niece, Charlotte, went missing during the champagne toast. The family searched frantically while security staff checked every accessible room. They found her 40 minutes later in a part of the manor closed to the public, standing in the long gallery before that portrait, the girl with the dead bird. Charlotte was completely still, her head tilted at the same angle as the girl in the painting. A slight smile on her face that looked wrong on a child so young. When her mother, frantic with worry, asked how she'd gotten past 3 locked doors, the child answered in a voice that seemed both her own and somehow not. "The girl in the painting told me the locks don't work if you're the right size. She said locks are for keeping big people out. It's not for keeping small people in." Her mother grabbed her hand. It was ice cold despite. The warm summer day Anne started to pull her away, but Charlotte resisted, turning back to look at the portrait. Then she asked, in that same strange voice that carried an echo of something older, "Mummy, why are there so many children living in the walls? They're very quiet because they're playing the game they've been playing for a very long time. Some of them have been playing since before you were born, before Grandma was born. They're very good at it now." Security footage from that night was reviewed at the family's insistence. It showed Charlotte walking through the manor alone, moving with purpose through corridors she shouldn't have known existed. She walked directly to locked doors, and they opened for her not because she touched them, but because they simply swung open as she approached, as if welcoming her. In several frames, particularly in the long gallery, there were other shapes moving in the shadows behind her, small shapes, child-sized, keeping pace with her but remaining just out of focus. Too many to count. The footage specialist who reviewed the tape noted something else, in 3 separate frames. Charlotte appeared to be holding hands with something that wasn't quite visible, something that left a cold spot on the thermal imaging they'd cross-referenced, something small and patient that walked beside her like a friend. Charlotte's family left immediately after she was found, despite having paid for accommodations through the weekend. The bride's father demanded the footage be destroyed. The trust complied. God. But copies exist in their security archives. Filed under Unexplained Incidents, a folder that has grown surprisingly thick over the years. Charlotte stopped speaking 3 days after the wedding. She started again 2 weeks later. She was different, quieter. She spent hours holding her breath, timing herself with a stopwatch. When her parents asked her to stop, she said the girl from the painting had taught her the game. She was getting very good at it. She said if she could hold her breath for 5 minutes, she could go back to Waddesdon and meet all the other children who'd learned to play. Her parents sold their home and moved to Scotland, as far from Buckinghamshire as they could manage, while staying in Britain. Waddesdon Manor remains open to the public year-round, welcoming families every day. The guidebooks mention nothing unusual. The tour guides smile and discuss art and history and the Rothschild legacy. Children run through the gardens and laugh in the sunshine. And late at night, when the visitors have gone home and the security guards make their reluctant rounds, sometimes they hear it. Soft footsteps in empty corridors. The sound of children whispering. The scratch of pencils on paper coming from behind a sealed door. The house is still beautiful. The house is still hungry. And the house is always, always patient. Last year, a conservation team was brought in to assess the manor's foundation. Old buildings settle over time, and Waddesdon had been showing signs of stress cracks appearing in walls that had stood solid for 150 years, doors that wouldn't close properly even after the hinges were replaced, cold spots that defied all logical explanation, and persisted regardless of heating system repairs. The team arrived in March 2024, equipped with ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging cameras, and structural analysis equipment. They expected to find the usual problems: soil subsidence, water damage, perhaps some deterioration in the original Victorian construction. What they found shouldn't have been possible. The foundation was riddled with small tunnels, barely 2 feet in diameter, carved through the earth in a complex network beneath the entire structure. The radar images showed passages that branched and intersected, creating a labyrinth directly under the manor. The tunnels weren't new. The earth inside them had been compressed for decades, perhaps centuries, the walls worn smooth by something passing through them repeatedly. They all led to the same place, directly beneath where the original stone marker had stood, the one Ferdinand had destroyed in 1874. The team leader, Dr. Sarah Chen, insisted on excavating the central point to determine if there was a natural cave system or sinkhole that might explain the phenomenon. The trust reluctantly agreed, though they limited the excavation to a small access shaft that could be quickly filled and covered. In that central chamber, 20 feet below the surface, they found objects that made Dr. Chen request an immediate meeting with trust officials. Children's shoes, dozens of pairs, arranged in careful rows. They dated from different eras: 18th century buckled leather, 19th century buttoned boots, 1940 school shoes, and disturbingly, a pair of modern trainers that couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Small toys lay scattered among them: a wooden doll with a cracked porcelain face, and eyes that reflected their torchlight with an odd luminescence, a tin soldier missing its head, a stuffed rabbit so deteriorated it was barely recognizable in newer items, a plastic action figure, a electronic keychain that no longer worked, and bones. Not many, just fragments, but enough to confirm what everyone had been afraid to say: small bones. Children's bones. The forensic analysis would later determine they belonged to at least 8 different individuals, ranging in age from approximately 6 to 12 years old. Spanning a time period of roughly 3 centuries, Dr. Chen's official report was clinical and professional. Her personal notes, found later in her office, told a different story. We shouldn't have gone down there. The moment we broke through into that chamber, the temperature dropped 15 degrees. Our equipment started malfunctioning, cameras shutting off, radar readings becoming nonsensical, showing movement in the tunnels where nothing should have been moving, and the smell, like earth and rot and something sweet underneath, like the perfume a child might wear. I heard breathing that wasn't coming from any of my team. Small, shallow breaths, the kind children make when they're trying to be very quiet. When I turned my torch toward one of the side tunnels, I swear I saw something small duck out of sight. Something wearing a white dress. The conservation team sealed the tunnels with concrete, pumping tons of it into the network over 3 days. For those 3 days, while the concrete dried, visitors to Waddesdon reported strange phenomena. Sounds from beneath the floors scratching like small hands trying to dig through stone. The gift shop employees reported that children visiting that week all drew the same picture over and over. Without any prompting or collaboration, a house on a hill with dozens of stick figures beneath it, all with their arms raised upward, all trying to get out. One little boy, no more than 7, told his mother that the children under the house were angry about the concrete. When she asked how he knew, he pointed to a crack in the gift shop wall and said, "They told me. They can come up through the cracks now. They said the concrete woe and hold them because they've been down there so long they were more like the earth than like people anymore. On the fourth day the sound stopped, but new cracks appeared in the long gallery, spreading across the ceiling in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like small handprints. Structural engineers examined them and found no explanation. The cracks were superficial, not deep enough to indicate any real structural problem, yet they continued to spread slowly, day by day, branching out in paths that seemed to follow roots through the house. Toward the nursery wing, toward the sealed study, toward every room where children's portraits hung. The National Trust issued a statement saying the manor was structurally sound and that the cracks were merely cosmetic, requiring simple plaster repair. Waddesdon remains open to the public, welcoming families year-round. The tours continue. The events calendar stays full. Children's birthday parties are still held in the gardens. No, but if you visit, pay attention in the long gallery. Count the portraits of children if you dare, though the staff warns against it and won't explain why. Watch the girl in the painting, the one holding the dead bird. Sometimes, when the light hits the canvas just right, you might notice details that weren't there before. Smudges of dirt on her white dress, fresh earth under her fingernails, a slight change in her expression. If you're there at dusk, just as the lights are coming on and shadows lengthen across the polished floors, you might notice something else. The girl in the painting is always smiling, but sometimes when no one's watching directly, when you only catch her in your peripheral vision, her head tilts slightly, as if she's listening, as if she's waiting, as if she's counting the children walking past, calculating, patient, making her selections. And if you have children with you, you might notice them stopping before that painting, staring up at it with unusual focus, their expressions going blank and distant. When you ask what they're looking at, they might say, "She wants to know if we'd like to stay. She says there are games we can play. She says we can hold our breath longer than we think. She says all the other children are waiting and they re lonely and they want friends, and the house has so many empty spaces to fill. The house is still hungry. It has always been hungry." Ferdinand built his dream on cursed ground, on earth that tasted death in 1641 and developed an appetite that never faded. Some places aren't meant for the living, meant for the in-between, for the ones who could unleave and the ones who woe and let go. For the children who played the game too well and held their breath until something else started breathing for them. Waddesdon Manor still stands on its hill, magnificent and terrible, a monument to beauty built on suffering. The tourists photograph its turrets, the art historians study its collections, the children run laughing through its halls during school visits, never knowing that the house is watching them, counting them, waiting for one who wanders away from the group, one who stops to stare too long at a portrait, one who hears the whispers and doesn't run. And late at night, when the tourists have gone home and the security guards make their reluctant rounds, you can still hear it sometimes in the long gallery. It's the sound of children whispering, the sound of something waiting, the sound of a game that never ends. That's been playing for centuries beneath the foundation, in the walls, in the spaces between the bricks where small things can hide. The sound of fingers scratching on the other side of the plaster, testing the cracks, finding the weak spots, slowly, patiently making their way through. The house feeds, the house grows, the house is always recruiting.